Hi everybody, this is Dr. Chris Doss. Thanks for joining us for this video today. Before we get started, I just want to share with you a few very exciting upcoming courses on Sabra Global Education. The first one is Jesus' Parables as Jewish Scripture with Dr. R. Stephen Notley, Distinguished Professor of Bible at Alliance University. This course is 4 sessions, 1 hour each, taking place on Mondays from March 27th to April 17th, 2023. The second one is the Passover Seder and the Last Supper, Jewish and Christian Traditions in Dialogue and Competition, taught by Rabbi Dr. Robert Harris of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. This course meets for 1 hour per week on Thursdays, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, March 9th, 16th, 23rd, and 30th. And the third one is the History of the Hebrew Alphabet, which I am teaching. And this course meets for 4 sessions of 45 minutes each on Saturdays, 12 p.m. Eastern Time, February 25th to March 18th. Hope you can join us for these classes, and we would appreciate your spreading the word. All right, Steve, thank you so much for joining me here. This is, I'm just very excited about this opportunity to share your vast knowledge with my audience on YouTube and with the Sabra Global Education community. So thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you for having me here, inviting me here. Yep.
Well, before we get into your research and what you're working on these days, I was hoping you could just share with us a little bit about how you got started in biblical scholarship. What was it that got you into the field? Who were your influences that turned you into the person that you are today?
Yeah, I grew up in a home and grew up in a religious environment. One thing led to another, and I decided I wanted to pursue religious studies, and I did undergraduate at Oral Roberts University in Greek New Testament. And I really didn't have an interest interestingly enough, I didn't have an interest in academia. I was more interested in the pastoral ministry part of it. One thing led to another, took me back into doing an MA there at ORU, and something clicked in it. I'm probably the only graduate student at ORU who's entered on academic probation. I was having too good a time as an undergraduate. I entered graduate school on academic probation and finished as the valedictorian of the graduate school. So I sort of underwent a metamorphosis during my graduate work. And I was encouraged to continue. And it took a couple of years to sort of come around deciding what I wanted to do. One of the things that captured me was I was in a class, Septuagint class, where we would do Hebrew and Greek. We would look at how the Hebrew was translated into Greek. And then the professor, right at the end of class, last 10 minutes of class, would jump into the Gospels and look at those same Greek structures and ask the question, what's the Hebrew underneath this? And it's intrigued me that there's a whole stream, that there's something else to be uncovered there running under. So I got very interested in the Hebraic or Semitic backgrounds to the Gospels. And I looked around a bit. I applied at Catholic University of America with Fitzmyer, but then our first child arrived, so that disrupted all those plans. And eventually, I was drawn to studying Jerusalem with David Flusser, who at the time was the preeminent sort of Jewish scholar on Second Temple period Jewish thought and Christian origins. So he really interested me. And so I went over in January of 1983, just for a month to sort of explore and see what it was like to live in Jerusalem, what it was like to study there. And one of the things that, people ask me, well, what was the thing that really caught your attention about Flusser that made you want to study with him? And he had a seminar every Tuesday evening in his home, and it was sort of like a continuing course in which they would go through the Gospels, Synoptic Gospels, looking at at Jewish backgrounds and sources, Jewish sources, thinks about it, and I mean, it continued. And some students would sit in there 5, 10 years, would take the course again and again and again. Uh, so one night when I was there in the class, Flusser was talking about some particular passage, and a student stopped him and said, Professor Flusser, when I took this class 3 years ago, you explained the passage this way. Now tonight you're explaining it that way. And Flusser sort of looked at him and said, well, I would hope that a man my age is still permitted to learn. They are trying to come closer and closer to the truth. Now, if you've done graduate work, you know how refreshing that is to find a scholar who opens the book and engages it freshly every time. And that's how he trained us. He said we should open it and read it as if it's the first time we're reading it, and to be surprised by the things that we find. And I found that quite refreshing, that I didn't just sit and him read his notes. And that was he was a learner. He was a person who studied to the very end and didn't mind jettisoning his ideas if he found something that changed the direction of his. And that sort of captured my attention. So I came back and told my wife, I said, I think this is where I need to go. And so we packed up, and 2 months later moved to Jerusalem in March of 1983. And that's sort of set the direction of course of my studies, at least. And working on my doctorate there over the next 8 years at Hebrew University. So I would say he, more than any person, left an indelible print on my scholarship, my thinking, how the method I go about in terms of looking at Jesus in the context of Second Temple period Jewish thought. Sometimes people aren't comfortable with the questions that you raise, but I think they're important questions that we reassess how we're reading the Gospels and looking at them, because I tell my students that the incarnation counts, that the issues of culture, history, time, language, all of those things come into play. That when we say that Jesus, as Christians say that Jesus came in the fullness of time, what does that mean? That means that he's right in the thick of developments in Jewish thinking that are going on in the first century of the Common Era. And too often when people are talking about the Hebraic or the Jewish background to the Gospels, they want to just open and read the Hebrew Bible. But that's not accurate. It's how the Hebrew Bible is being read, interpreted, and applied. Are the important issues, because how they're reading them in the first century isn't the same way that they're reading them, let's say, in the 5th, 6th century BCE. They're reading it in the context of what's going on around them, and I'm interested in how Scripture is being read, the Hebrew Bible is being read and applied to a very complex world. And I find Jesus right in the thick of that conversation. So again, sometimes you ask different questions, and sometimes to be honest, sometimes the answers they're not always comfortable. But I think they're questions that need to be asked as we engage the beginnings of Christianity, Christian origins, looking at Jesus in the context of first century thought. I have a student right now doing his doctorate at Hebrew University in Paul. And I have to confess, I find Paul a mystery. I find Paul very, very difficult to understand on sort of the landscape of Jewish thought. I find him a real challenge. I find Jesus much easier to understand than I do Paul. Paul, I find him mixing and matching things that come from not only different streams of Jewish thought, but sometimes opposing views of Jewish thought. And I don't know how he mixes those together. It's a very interesting mixture, looking at how Paul is engaging it. So when this student was going off to Hebrew University, he said, "What should I do?" And I said, "Paul, do it, Paul, for me. I'd like you to explain to me the Apostle Paul, because he remains an enigma for me.
Well, that's one we're going to have to get into sometime, because I know that those who are listening are just fascinated. And I think too, when one just opens the New Testament for the first time, and you read maybe a portion of the Gospels and then jump over to, say, Romans or First Corinthians or something like that, it's strikingly different. The genre of literature, just to start with, is different, but there is that palpable difference between Jesus and Paul. So we'll have to get into that in more detail sometime.
Would love to.
So you mentioned, I want to go back a little bit, because you talked or alluded to the fact that the Jewish thinking in roughly the time of Jesus, the turn of the era, was very different from ancient Israelite thinking. Can you talk a little bit about how ancient Israelite religion and ancient Israelite religious thought would differ from Second Temple Jewish thought? What are some of the new or most distinctive developments in Jewish thought that you wouldn't find in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament?
Well, first of all, the thinking in the Israelite thinking Hebrew Bible is your area, not mine. So I'm also clear. I love it when students want to ask me questions about creation or Noah's Ark, and I go, nope. I became a New Testament scholar for that very reason. I don't have to address those questions. I have to deal with the other end of the book and the question of Revelation and what all that means. But I stay in my lane when it comes to these questions. But tongue in cheek, I say, I don't really care when Isaiah was written, how many Isaiahs there were. It doesn't really matter to me. What matters to me is that by the first century of the Common Era, it's one book, and they're reading it and they're applying it to it's a whole part of Midrash. They're interpreting it because they think that they believe it to be relevant to how they live out their lives in a very complex world. I think sometimes Christians do not appreciate the complications of the world in which Jesus lived. He lived in a time of military occupation, injustice, hopes for redemption that didn't seem to be anytime soon. People were asking the question, how do we realize God's redemption, which of course in Jewish terms also meant liberation. It has a political aspect to it as well. And people were asking those difficult questions. My understanding of my approach to this is that I think there's a sea change that happens in the 2nd century BCE. The events that lead to the Hasmonean revolt, the Antiochian persecutions, religious persecution, which is really not a very common thing. You were not persecuted for religious differences in the ancient world. That's a bit of historians struggle trying to understand what was motivating Antiochus IV in doing his sort of crackdown upon the Jews, limiting them in terms of their religious practice, and the events that lead to the revolt and the persecutions that happen. And I think if we listen carefully to the voices that are speaking in that time, which involves reading intertestamental literature, which I think is very, very important. I always encourage my students to read it because you're listening to. It's like reading somebody's email. You're reading what's going on. What are people concerned about? What issues that they're addressing? Because their issues aren't necessarily our issues. And the challenge for us is to climb into their skin and try to hear things as they hear them, see them as they see them. And we hear about the events that are going on that speak to they cannot understand what they've done to justify such suffering. And for instance, you have a book, The Testament of Moses, where you have a figure named Tax, when he cries out and he says, who else has ever, suffered such things that we're suffering? And we don't deserve it. And I think that's a voice of that period of time where in the Hebrew Bible, the general idea is that God blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked. Now, you do have Job, so you have struggling with the Odyssey and where is God when, bad things happen to good people and that kind of thing. But this is a different question. This is where is God when, bad things happen to good people, but when bad things happen to people because they determined to stay good, they refuse to transgress. Here they're suffering not just out of happenstance. We're not talking about a hurricane or a tornado or a car wreck or something of that nature. We're actually talking about people who are suffering because they refuse to transgress the commandments. And that actually is a more acute problem. And I think out of that situation, you have it's the epicenter, in my humble view, it's the epicenter of sort of Second Temple period Jewish thought. It's from there, I think almost every major theme or idea that develops in that intertestamental period comes out of that. You think of the idea of resurrection. Resurrection is a seminal idea, certainly in the Hebrew Bible, but it's not a dominant idea. But out of this period of time, suddenly resurrection, as Nicholsburg has written, really takes on a prominence, specifically to address, the righteous whose lives are cut short and the wicked who live long lives. So how do you rectify that? You have resurrection and judgment in the afterlife so that can all be dealt with. And that you have a number of issues that are that come out of that period of time. One of them, I think, is quite significant, is the issue of Jewish humanism, a humanistic approach, which Flusser has written on it extensively, quite a bit, and I think it's very important in terms of understanding Jesus's ethics, his teaching. It lies at he's right in the middle of that conversation of how do we relate to each other and taking the humane approach. How do we view each other